Good morning or good afternoon again, everyone. I have to say a personal note. First of all, whenever I hear anyone talking about recent geopolitical events, especially um, in Ukraine, I feel like my content or my whatever I will say might be comparatively meaningless, given what's at stake there, and especially I'm just looking at my calendar at the moment, and I'm a native German from Berlin, especially on the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Um, these kind of Cold War rhetorics coming back, or having to see them coming back, is quite shocking to me personally, right? But with that said, my presentation is about looking at the enterprise market and looking at specifically hyperscalers in the enterprise and their activity in the enterprise market. So what I'm going to do is I'll briefly look at the enterprise opportunities for 5G, then look at key drivers for cellular connectivity and 5G in that market, look at some of the recent events and how that changed enterprise demands towards connectivity and digitization, and then start looking at hyperscalers, their telco ambitions, what sort of deployment models that they're looking at, briefly talk about them in the wider ecosystem of private network solution providers, the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats. Look at the missing piece in terms of infrastructure, and specifically when it comes to the radio access network, and then conclude with some implications for the legacy telco industry and some recommendations, right? But to kick things off, it's good to look at the enterprise opportunity for 5G. And what we see here until 2028, and I know I'm cautiously going beyond the 2025 timeline here, because especially when you talk about enterprise 5G, we're looking really at growing or picking up pace beyond 2025. And we'll come to why this is the case in a second. So according to what we see in the market is that by 2028, we're looking at a market that is roughly 31 billion, or just above 31 billion. Private network deployments accounting for 60% and network slicing 40% of revenues each. Important thing to mention is that in this picture, we're only looking at 5G numbers. So if we were to include 4G or LTE in this picture, the private networks revenue and the split of, or the proportion of private networks revenue would be much higher, because simply we see at the moment, and for the time being certainly, private network deployments being still primarily driven by 4G LTE technology. Now, with that said, going forward, I think private network or purely private network deployments certainly target large enterprises, because it's quite complex to implement and to manage and operate, while a more network slicing or even a hybrid network approach, cloud-based network approach, will be appealing to small and medium enterprise SMEs. And as we see the market pivoting to slowly but surely pivoting towards these SMEs, I think a more hybrid model, or even in the most extreme case, a network slicing deployment or utilizing network slicing to offer dedicated connectivity to enterprises will become more and more important, simply because there are much more, in terms of the numbers, there are much more small and medium enterprises in the world than there are large multinational corporations, the likes of Mercedes, Volkswagen, Porsche, Siemens, or in the US, you look at Rockwell, Ford, General Electric, and kind of those. Now, key verticals that drive the demand for enterprise connectivity in general and cellular connectivity specifically are certainly in manufacturing, logistics, oil and gas, and mining. Key reason being is that they look at, or they provide most reliable connectivity because they're characterized by a somewhat hazardous environment where with a high degree of highly critical use cases might be either mission critical or even life critical in some aspects. If you think about mining, for example, where you have to rely, or to automate your operations, you have to rely on high availability of your network connectivity, because otherwise your workers' lives could be at risk in a mine, for example. And this is a risk that you don't want to be taking in these kind of circumstances. Now, with that said, let's look at some of the macroeconomic and geopolitical conditions that drive or that have changed demand for enterprise connectivity recently. And while this slide focuses a lot on the COVID effects, or the effects from COVID and subsequent lockdowns, we now see an additional aspect as well, or two additional aspects really popping up, especially in Europe, is sustainability or reduction of energy consumption and supply chain issues, or mitigating disruptions in the supply chain because of subsequent sudden and reimposing lockdowns in, for example, Asia Pacific countries that are still battling to some extent, or that are still following a zero COVID strategy, and therefore keep reimposing lockdowns. Other aspects like transport and logistics industry is hugely grappling with shortage of manual labor at the moment, because simply they're failing, these sectors are failing to scale up and to meet rising demands after the world economies and societies have opened up subsequently after COVID-19 lockdowns. The other aspect, obviously, or sustainability aspect and energy consumption aspect, obviously hugely fueled by the Russian war or the Russian invasion of Ukraine and subsequent energy crisis in specifically Europe. Actually, I've been to the US recently, and also, although there are some concerns about energy efficiency and energy consumption, it's not to the extent that it is in Europe, especially continental Europe. Actually, so yeah, all of these events, all of these conditions really drive enterprises' demand for digitization and connectivity. The interesting aspect that we're seeing, well, that I've seen in my discussions with enterprises, is that cellular connectivity is not really seen as a remedy for all of these problems, which I think to some extent is unjustified, because you have huge opportunities and potential use cases to use cellular connectivity to reduce energy consumption, because you can optimize your process, because enterprises can optimize their processes. And we have done studies, or we've done white papers on this, and we can talk about this later on, how much, and try and quantify how much 5G connectivity specifically can contribute towards an enterprise's efforts to save energy. One of the reasons why 5G, specifically 5G connectivity is not seen as fit to address these challenges and to address these very, very urgent pain points is an insecurity around timeline, actually, and the device available or the availability of industrial grade devices. Now we'll look at this slide and really see that most of the enterprise characteristics or most of the 5G features that enterprises are looking for really come with release 16 and 17. And even beyond that, you look at 18, 19, anything that comes with 5G advanced now. Whereas what we're stuck with at the moment, what the industry is stuck with at the moment is chipsets, especially in the industrial equipment market, or when it comes to industrial devices. You're really looking at release 15, so enhanced mobile broadband capabilities. Now, release 16 devices are expected to emerge, and we have to keep delaying our forecast actually, because they are expected to emerge in Q4 of 2023, and with at scale or reaching scale in even beginning of 2024. So that contributes hugely to enterprises' dissatisfaction to some extent, even or impatience, because they have been relied, or they have relied on, to some extent, unreliable communication from ICT vendors or from anyone really in the ICT industry, which they only realize now that the 5G that is available to them now is not the 5G that they have been promised back in even 2019, right? Where the entire talk was about URLLC and MMTC features that are in release 16 and 17. Now, there are three, when you look at why enterprises deploy a private network, there are three over, say, any kind of public network connectivity. There are three main drivers, and I want to talk to them about them only briefly because I appreciate the time. Customizability, quality of service and SLA control, and network integrity. All of these, especially network integrity, is important for enterprises, as you have both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation, for example, think of a manufacturer that wants to automate or wants to use a private network to automate and monitor the condition of their production assets. Now, this is highly critical and very sensitive information that you don't want to have to leave premises, that you always want to stay on your premises. On the other hand, extrinsic motivation, for example, in a healthcare environment, are about regulatory framework that regulates the sensitivity of, for example, patient healthcare data. So where you're prescribed from, or where you're forced to, from a regulatory point of view, to guarantee that integrity and on-premise. On the other hand, what we see is that there is main consideration from enterprise point of view, and this is even more true now in the recent climate of inflation and soaring prices of production. Enterprises are really, really concerned about their total cost of ownership. And this is where reutilizing public network resources or public infrastructure really comes into play to reduce this total cost of ownership and drive down the investment costs that enterprises are faced with for deploying private network. Because what we're seeing at the moment, and we've done studies and we've done surveys with enterprises before, actually asking them, is the high upfront investment was even, and we did this even before the recent crisis of offshoring costs of production, is that rising huge upfront or large upfront investment was the main barrier for deploying private. So now this is where hyperscalers are coming in, and we see. I only want to talk about this briefly. Actually, we see that they're coming in with 3 different models into the telco domain. Collaboration. Either they look at collaboration, acquisitions, as in the case of Microsoft Azure and the firm, what they've done with the firm networks and Metaswitch, or as a kind of compromise or combination of the best of both worlds, really a co-creation initiative between hyperscalers and network operators, where they agree on a joint go-to-market strategy, but on a project basis, so that both, in other words, both entities still preserve their own identity, still preserve their own business infrastructure, but this co-creation initiative is just more firm, was firmer than a loose collaboration and a loose, say, memorandum of understanding. So there is commitment from both parties. And this is why we see that these co-creation initiatives will be long-term the most successful, or at least expected to be long-term the most successful role of hyperscalers in this whole market. And in other words, there's room for that also means there's room for legacy telco industry players and hyperscalers. I don't think hyperscalers will take away all of that, right? Now, with that said, let's look at the hyperscaler deployment model a bit. And we see there are 2 different models, really. Either we're talking about a purely on-premise model, which you can see, for example, if you look at AWS with their on-premise deployment. And it's really very similar to what you would expect from a traditional telco industry provider, network infrastructure vendor. You have all different layers on premises. So your services layer, your platform, and the infrastructure all remains on premise. Fairly straightforward. If you look at it, or the upside of this is that you have a maximum possible degree of integrity and customizability. On the other hand, you have particularly high cost of ownership, which will limit your addressable market really to, on the one hand, large enterprises, but on the other hand, also certain verticals that have these very stringent requirements towards integrity, customizability, and are therefore also willing to invest larger amounts of money, or to invest higher amounts of money into a private networking solution. On the other hand, we see a cloud-based deployment, pardon me, where you can have either the platform and services in a public cloud, as for example AWS does with Wavelength, and the infrastructure on premise, so particularly talking about the radio access network there, and an edge deployment in most cases. Or you can have a combination of public cloud and telco edge in this deployment. Reason for why is infrastructure always on premise is, I think that what we'll see going forward is that because enterprises are governed by or are always looking at highly sensitive data and information that they would always want to see on premise. So there will always, at least in the overwhelming number of cases, there will always be need for an edge deployment on-premise that will then and utilize some cloud, or especially the control function, or could see the control functions outsourced into a hybrid cloud model, right? But the user plane function really will, in our opinion, will always reside on enterprise premises. Now, but even so, this still comprises some network integrity and degree of customizability, but does a lot in terms of minimizing TCO and site space necessary for deployment. And also you have certain efficiency enhancements by using synergies with existing cloud resources. The other aspect that this brings to the table is that enterprises, or the end vertical enterprises, are by no means networking experts, and they don't want to become networking experts. So when we've asked them in previous surveys, and in all of my discussions that I've had, it becomes quite clear that there is a vacuum, even in a private network deployment, of network management and network operation. Yes, the sound of a private network sounds very appealing to them, but they realize, yeah, but who will do my network? Who will manage my network? Who will do the automation or the operation, sorry, of this network? And this is where hyperscalers or even system integrators or specialized network operators come in, right? Now, what we see on this slide, or the main point of this slide, is that hyperscalers, let's focus on hyperscalers in the interest of time, is their strength is the experience in data management, existing relationship with verticals, and more importantly, also enterprises are looking in their digitization strategies, are looking more towards cloud and edge. So I've been to various industry events recently, trade shows, where a lot of talk was around how to utilize cloud for their digitization purposes. Not a lot of talk was about 5G, admittedly, or even any kind of wireless connectivity technologies, simply because enterprises don't care about what connectivity they use in the end. So I think this existing relationship and the value prop, or the tangible value proposition of the cloud will be important. Will it be an important building block for hyperscalers? Weakness, or the main weakness, is the lack of last mile connectivity infrastructure. And let's look at that in now, actually. So if you look, there are different strategies that hyperscalers are looking at to address, or to gain access to last mile connectivity, or the radio access network. AWS, for example, uses its marketplace to attract RAN vendors. Similarly, Microsoft Azure has traditionally focused on enabling network operators, CSPs, but they're also looking towards system integrators. And obviously their acquisition of Metaswitch and the firm networks gives them an advantage in last mile connect, or in infrastructure, really, which they now have in-house. But what you can see from that acquisition as well is that aligning these business units seems to take a lot of time and comes with its own challenges, right? So an acquisition is not always the best possible solution, but an exposure of on, for example, the marketplace, or what Google Cloud is targeting with their extensive channel strategy, and system integrators, including system integrators, is a very interesting model. I don't want to talk about this business model slide too much. Essentially, we're moving away, or the legacy telco world is forced to move away from a connectivity as a service model towards a more comprehensive everything as a service model. And because I don't like the word, or I feel like the industries, we're creating a new buzzword with this everything as a service. I feel it's much better to talk about all of these different components individually and what they actually mean. But this is essentially, there's huge development at stake here for the legacy telco world. Now, the other thing that is changing is the go-to-market path, really, and there could be two possibilities for the hyperscalers to play a role in here. Either we see hyperscalers will provide some component, their cloud infrastructure, into, say, a system integrator, which will then deploy on, in this case, the solution on the factory floor, but it could be any kind of enterprise. Or theoretically possible would be that hyperscalers could also take over the system integrator role and combine this with their cloud infrastructure capabilities. But in reality, what we're seeing at the moment is, if you look at recent announcements from Google Cloud, who partner with system integrators, and also AWS, who explicitly, with their private 5G solution, they don't want to take over any kind of integration capabilities. We see more of this left-hand side go-to-market path evolving. So, which means that hyperscalers will not take over everything. By all means, they will be an important provider of their capabilities, but there's room for legacy telco industry players as well. With that said, briefly look at some of the spheres of influence. What I said, and this really summarizes what I said, is while web scale or hyperscalers have the most comprehensive offering, really, for an end-to-end private networking solution, is what is missing at this stage is particularly the connectivity element. And they will partner for connectivity with the likes of MNO, the likes of network operators, in case they need access to spectrum, or in the case of the US, for example, where you have CBRS, or even in certain parts of Europe, where there's licensed spectrum available for enterprises, they will still need to rely on partnerships with infrastructure vendors, for example, to gain this last mile connectivity. And with that said, there will be reorganization in the market, but as I said earlier, we don't think that hyperscalers will take over everything, and this whole scaremongering is a bit of sensationalist, and because there will always be room for legacy telco industry players, but they will have to change, certainly, and they remain in a challenged position. And with that said, I took a bit longer than I expected to. I'm very sorry about that. But I want to
don't worry. You're within your time, but we've no time.
Yes, but I wanted to leave some time for questions.
Not to worry. People can contact you subsequently. And I think two things really that you said. Well, there was so much there. I think it'll take us all a while to absorb it. It was really good stuff. Thank you. But I thought one thing that was really interesting that you said was that there's a vacuum in the network management and operations. And that sounds to me like great news for telcos. And,
yes.
And I think the other thing, and this is something I've heard a lot recently, is that customers don't care about the technology behind connectivity. Yeah. And the operators really need to take that on board and talk about maybe intelligent connectivity, by which I just mean providing the most appropriate type of connectivity in any given set of circumstances and for any given application, and stop banging on about 5G or whatever. I just feel that they need to absorb that lesson. I think you were going to say something about maybe the network management and operations vacuum and what it could mean for telcos and an opportunity there.
Yes, certainly. There's great opportunity for telcos there, because in the end, those are the capabilities that network or that CSPs bring to the table, right? But what it means, or what it needs to from the telcos, is they will need to move away from, or they will need to evolve their value proposition slightly from centering around their licensed spectrum assets, or putting their value proposition around their licensed spectrum assets, and move more towards putting these network management and operation capabilities onto in the key focus, right? Because even though yes, you have spectrum in most parts of the world, spectrum is still limited, or licensed spectrum still is limited to network operators. But over time, inevitably, with more liberalization coming, or regimes coming on board, especially in Europe, licensed spectrum will lose its power as a monetizable asset, right? So keep that and put network management capabilities into the focus. Also, what telcos need to do to attract enterprises, I think, is move away from what they used to, and this will be a huge operational challenge, is move away from the sales process that they learned to, or that they used to in the consumer domain, where selling of connectivity was a very one-directional interaction, or still is. And at one point in time, I as a CSP sell connectivity to you. That's usually in the consumer domain. That's the interaction done. In the enterprise domain, I think it will be more complicated, and what you'll need to adopt to is a more bi-directional exchange, and almost a consultative approach, right?
It's what do you need, rather than here, this is what I've got, and this is what I'm going to sell. Yeah,
it's what you need, instead of a build it or offer it and they will come approach, which still works in the consumer domain.
Well, Leo, we've got to go. I'm sorry to say, but one of our viewers has said, or attendees, I should say, has said an excellent presentation. And we've got a really quick question. So manufacturing is seen as the biggest opportunity for 5G. Are you seeing the reality of manufacturing equipment and its life cycle impacting when that demand comes? So maybe as people are looking to replace equipment, they're thinking about the whole renewal cycle or refresh cycle.
Yes, and that is one main challenge actually for the telco industry.
Yeah.
Because what they will need to think of is, and that's an excellent question actually, because there are two aspects of this cost component, right? One is the deployment cost of cellular connectivity. The other one is that you can't and that you shouldn't underestimate is the retrofitting cost. You will always, in a manufacturing environment, you will, unless you talk about a real greenfield deployed factory, for example, you will always have retrofitting. Because if you talk about manufacturing production assets, they're multi-million-dollar euro deployments, and they stay for several decades, right? So I think that is a huge limiting factor, or that is a limiting factor actually, that will make manufacturing, especially for new entrants, a particularly hard vertical to get around, because there's just so much infrastructure already and so many assets to retrofit. That will require some primary knowledge of how to sensibly retrofit them, and where 5G and cellular connectivity could actually play in that field of connectivity, or not only connectivity technologies, but all production really.
Okay, Leo, thank you very much. A really good presentation. And I'm sorry we have to move on. I think we could talk about this for hours, but we hope to see you back at a future event. Thank you so much. And happy Berlin Wall Day.
Thank you.